A little tech tip I can give you is if you ever wanted to see if you possibly had a restricted fuel filter and you didn't want to just take it off and change it to see if you got better power response out of the engine, you could always go ahead and calculate that fuel pump speed. Because what happens when you have a mechanical restriction, so if I got a fuel pump over here turning and developing pressure and it hits a brick wall like a restricted filter, two things are going to happen. The RPM, because the backup of that fuel flow is going to go back into the spinning operation of this pump here, it's going to slow down the spinning process of that pump. So the RPM is going to drop, but it's going to be working harder, so it's going to be drawing more amperage. So on your screens, you guys have the little mathematical equation here that talks about how to determine how fast that fuel pump is spinning. Now you'd have to compare it to a known good value. So if you all of a sudden let's say you worked on a lot of these vehicles, let's say they were General Motors in nature, you could take a vehicle with no kind of issue, get a known good value, so that when you have a troublesome vehicle, you've got something to compare your specs to. One last thing about the old-fashioned current ramping and all that kind of stuff with fuel pumps is if you ever came across a vehicle that maybe didn't crank, and then some old-timer in your industry taught you that, hey, if you hit the starter with the hammer, it may start to crank. Or a fuel pump that's not pumping any fuel, but you hit the gas tank with the rubber mallet, and then all of a sudden it starts pumping fuel again. Or a blower motor or any type of motor device that has an intermittent failure to it, on your screens now shows what that intermittent failure screen looks like. So a typical automotive fuel pump would have 8 commutator segments. Some vehicles would only have 6, but most of them would all have 8. So if I knew that, and the way how I could tell is I could just I could hook up to the current clamp to the fuel pump power wire or the ground wire, whichever easier was to get to, and I could just start the vehicle up and look for a unique hump. So once I found the unique hump, I could count how many other humps were on the screen before that unique hump occurred again. And that would tell me if I had 8 or 6. Once I knew how many I had, I could do a mathematical equation like we've got on the screen there, and I could tell you this fuel pump spinning at, say, 6,000 RPM or 4,500 RPM or whatever the time factor happens to be. And once I knew that, if I saw that every once in a while, so the vehicle may be running, no problem, and let's say this was hooked to a fuel pump, every once in a while if I saw how that waveform sharply drops down, well, I know for a fact that's the reason why this thing has an intermittent no start. Because when you shut this rotating pump off and the brushes actually end up in that area, unless there's some kind of vibration that's occurring to get the brushes to have a better contact, that fuel pump is not going to want to start spinning again the next time you go and crank the vehicle or try to start the vehicle. So it would be a no start type of condition. And that's the same type of pattern you'd find, even though this is from a fuel pump, same type of pattern you'd find if you had a starter motor exhibiting that same condition, or maybe a cooling fan motor, or any kind of motor. That's the type of pattern that you'd have there. One other little thing I wanted to talk about was when the fuel pump is first given power, it's not uncommon if you have your scope hooked up that you'd see the pattern that you see on the screen now, where we have a lot more amperage to start turning the fuel pump. So if you got a stationary device and you got to try to get momentum building, it draws more amperage, but within about a half a second, that amperage level will drop way down. So that's not uncommon that you'd see that as you're cranking the car over, first turning the key on, whatever, to see the higher voltage spike, but within about a half a second, that voltage spike should come back down.